The afternoon sun blazed over Lagos, like a furious god, turning the corrugated iron roofs of Mushin Market into shimmering waves of heat that distorted the air itself. In the heart of this chaos, where traders shouted prices in Yoruba and Igbo, where the smell of roasted plantain mixed with diesel fumes, where life moved with the raw urgency of survival, there stood a faded blue tarp, stretched between two wooden poles. Beneath it, a woman worked with the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from years of carrying burdens too heavy to name. Her name was Amara Nwosu, and her hands, strong and scarred from labor, moved in a rhythm as ancient as the land itself, kneading fufu in a wide wooden mortar. The sweat on her brow caught the light like tiny diamonds, but there was no luxury in her life, only the relentless poetry of survival. Beside her, two boys, identical in every way that mattered, helped serve customers with bright eyes and quick smiles. Chidi and Chidera, 7 years old, with their mother's grace and something else, something they had never known but carried in their blood, like an inheritance they could not spend. They had their father's high cheekbones, his intense gaze, and behind each of their left ears, a distinctive birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. The old women in the market would sometimes stare at those boys and whisper among themselves, because they remembered. They remembered when Amara first came to this market 8 years ago, her belly swollen with twins, her eyes hollow with a grief that had no words. They remembered how she never spoke of the father, how she worked until her hands bled, how she built this small fufu stand with nothing but faith and refusal to surrender. And now, watching her stir the pot, while her sons laughed and played between customers, they saw what poverty could not erase, dignity, fierce and unbreakable as iron. Across the sprawling city, in a world that might as well have existed on another planet, Adabio Okoro stood in his glass-walled office on the 40th floor of the building that bore his name. Below him, Lagos stretched out, like a kingdom he had conquered through brilliance, ruthlessness, and an ability to silence the voice of conscience whenever it whispered too loudly. He was 38 years old, handsome in the way that money polishes a man, dressed in a suit that cost more than most families earned in a year. His tech empire had made him one of the youngest billionaires in West Africa, and his face smiled from magazine covers with the confidence of a man who believed he had escaped his origins. But origins are not so easily escaped, and the past is not a debt that disappears simply because you stop acknowledging it. Today, Adabio was preparing for the merger that would triple his wealth, negotiating with foreign investors who wanted assurance of legacy, of continuity, of heirs to carry the empire forward. His wife, Ngozi, beautiful, sophisticated, and as emotionally available as marble, had been pressing him about children for months, her voice sharp with the anxiety of a woman who knew that her value in his eyes was tied to her womb. But Ngozi's womb was empty, and this fact sat between them like a third presence in their mansion, unspoken, but always there. Adabio told himself it didn't matter, that there were other ways to secure legacy, that adoption or surrogacy could solve the problem with the same efficiency he applied to business deals. What he would not admit, even to himself, was that 8 years ago he had made a choice that had carved out something essential from his chest, leaving him wealthy beyond measure, but hollow in ways he could not name. The collision of these two worlds came on an ordinary Thursday, in the way that fate often arrives, not with trumpets or warnings, but with a traffic jam and a driver's frustrated decision to take a shortcut. Adabio sat in the back of his Mercedes, scrolling through contracts on his tablet, barely aware of the city moving past his tinted windows. His driver, trying to avoid the gridlock on the expressway, turned into streets that wealthy men rarely traveled, streets where the real Lagos lived and breathed and struggled. Mushin Market opened up around them like a living organism, chaotic and vital, and Adabio glanced up with mild irritation, about to tell his driver to find another route. That's when he saw them. Two boys, laughing, as they chased each other between the market stalls, their faces so familiar that his heart stopped beating for 3 full seconds. They moved with his own childhood gestures, had his exact smile, and when one of them turned to call out to someone, Adabio saw the crescent-shaped birthmark behind his left ear. The same birthmark Adabio's grandmother had called the mark of the Okoro men, passed down through generations like a signature from the ancestors. His hands began to tremble. The tablet slipped from his fingers, and then he saw her, Amara, stirring a pot of fufu with those same gentle hands that had once touched his face with love he didn't deserve. Wearing a faded wrapper and a headscarf, her beauty undimmed by poverty, but transformed by it into something harder, something that had survived what would have broken lesser souls. She was singing softly. He couldn't hear the words, but he remembered her voice, remembered nights when she had sung while cleaning his house, before he was rich enough to be cruel, before he had looked at her swollen belly and seen only a threat to his ambitions. "Drive," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Drive now." The Mercedes pulled away, but Adabio's eyes remained locked on the rearview mirror until the market disappeared behind a curtain of dust and distance. That night, he could not sleep. He lay beside Ngozi in their bedroom that overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by luxury that suddenly felt like a prison, and all he could see were those two boys with his face, playing in the dust he had spent his entire adult life trying to escape. The memories came flooding back with the force of a dam breaking. Amara had been his maid when he was still building his company, working 18-hour days, living in a modest apartment in Yaba, dreaming of the empire he would build. She had been kind to him, had believed in him when investors laughed at his pitches, had stayed up with him through those long nights when failure seemed certain. Their relationship had grown slowly, naturally, like a plant finding light. He had loved her, or thought he did, in the way a young man loves when he's too busy chasing the future to fully inhabit the present. When she told him she was pregnant, he was 6 months away from his first major breakthrough, a government contract that would change everything. He looked at her swollen belly and saw not children, but obstacles, not life, but complications. He gave her money, a substantial amount, he told himself, enough to start over, and he told her to leave. He told her that a man climbing from nothing couldn't afford the weight of a family, that she would understand one day, that this was for the best. She had looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a sadness so profound it seemed to age her 10 years in a moment. She took the money and left without a word. And Adabio, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to compartmentalize, buried that memory beneath layers of success, telling himself that he had made the rational choice, the necessary choice, the only choice a man like him could make. But now, years later, lying in silk sheets while his wife slept coldly beside him, Adabio realized that some choices don't stay buried. They grow in the dark, becoming the very things we feared they would destroy. By morning, he had made a decision. He called his most trusted investigator, a man who specialized in finding things people wanted to remain hidden, and gave him 3 words: find out everything. Within 48 hours, the report arrived in a sealed envelope, and Adabio read it alone in his office, with hands that shook despite his attempts at control. Amara had never cashed his check. She had torn it into pieces and returned it to his old address with a note that simply said, "I will take money for love." She had worked 3 jobs while pregnant, cleaning offices at night, selling vegetables in the morning, braiding hair in the afternoons, until the twins were born. She had named them Chidi and Chidera. God exists, and what God has written. After their birth, she had nearly died from complications, spending 2 weeks in a government hospital where the care was minimal and the indignity was infinite. When she recovered, she began building her Fufu business with borrowed capital from the market women, who saw in her something worth investing in. The boys were brilliant students, always at the top of their class, despite attending a school with crumbling walls and teachers who were paid irregularly. They asked about their father constantly, and Amara told them only that he was a man who lost his way, but might one day find it. She never spoke his name. She never sought him out, never threatened exposure, never demanded support. She simply loved those boys with a ferocity that made poverty irrelevant and raised them to be good men in a world that often punished goodness. Adabio finished reading the report and wept for the first time since his grandmother's funeral. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest, from that hollow place he had pretended didn't exist. The crisis arrived, as crises do, when life was already balanced on a knife's edge. Chidi, the more adventurous of the twins, fell ill with malaria, not the mild kind that passes with medication, but the cerebral kind that kills children in Nigeria with ruthless efficiency. Amara rushed him to the hospital, her heart a drum of terror in her chest, and the doctors gave her a number, 250,000 naira for treatment, for the bed, for the medications that would save her son's life. She had 30,000 in her tin box under her bed, the savings of 6 months that she had been putting aside for the boys' secondary school fees. She begged the doctors for time, promising to return with the money, and they gave her 48 hours with the exhausted pity of people who had heard such promises 1,000 times before. Amara ran through the market like a woman possessed, asking for loans from every trader she knew. Mama Obi, the palm oil seller who had become like a mother to her, contributed 5,000. Other women pooled their coins, 1,000 here, 3,000 there. The collective mercy of the poor, who understand that poverty is not a moral failure, but a condition that could befall anyone. By the end of the first day, Amara had gathered 120,000 naira, and Chidi's fever was climbing toward the threshold where brain damage becomes permanent. In desperation, in a decision that cost her every ounce of pride she had carefully preserved, Amara made her way to Victoria Island, to the glass tower that bore the name Okoro Technologies, in letters that seemed to mock her from their height. She had never been to his office before, had only seen pictures in newspapers, in magazines, that showed him cutting ribbons and shaking hands with presidents. The building rose into the sky like a monument to everything she was not, all clean lines and reflective surfaces that seemed designed to repel people like her. Amara walked into the lobby in her faded market clothes, her headscarf askew, her eyes red from sleepless nights, and every person who saw her knew immediately that she didn't belong. The security guards stopped her before she reached the elevators, their voices polite but firm. She explained that she needed to see Adabio Okoro, that it was urgent, that it concerned his children. They exchanged glances, the kind of glances that said they had heard every con, every scheme, every desperate story. They asked for an appointment. She had none. They asked for documentation. She had none. They told her, with the practiced patience of people who do this daily, that Mr. Okoro was not available, that she should send an email, that someone would get back to her. Amara sat in that lobby for 6 hours, refusing to leave, her dignity stripped away, piece by piece, as office workers walked past her, with averted eyes, as the security guards grew less polite and more insistent, as the sun moved across the sky, and her phone rang with calls from the hospital, asking when she would return with the money. Finally, as evening fell, and the office workers began to leave for the day, 2 security guards physically escorted her to the door. She did not resist. She simply walked out into the Lagos evening, and when she reached the street, the rain began to fall. Not the gentle rain of reprieve, but the angry rain of the wet season, coming down in sheets that soaked through her clothes in seconds. She collapsed on the sidewalk outside the building, her body finally surrendering to the weight of years, and she wept, with the kind of abandon that only comes when you've held strong for too long. A janitor, an old Igbo man who was leaving after his shift, helped her to her feet and gave her his umbrella and the last 1,000 naira in his wallet, because he recognized the look in her eyes, the look of a mother watching her child slip away. Inside the building, 40 floors above the rain-soaked street, Adabio sat in his office, reviewing the security footage on his computer. He had known she was there. His assistant had informed him hours ago that a woman claiming to have his children was causing a disturbance in the lobby. He had told them to handle it, had returned to his conference call with London investors, had pushed the thought away with the same efficiency he had pushed away all uncomfortable truths. But now, alone in his office, he watched the footage of Amara sitting in his lobby, watched her shoulders sag as hope drained from her body, watched her being escorted out by security, watched her collapse in the rain. He played it again and again, and something inside him, something that had been calcified by years of ruthless decision-making, began to crack. He called his investigator again, his voice hoarse. Find out why she came. The answer arrived an hour later. Chidi was in the hospital, dying, and Amara couldn't pay. Adabio stood at his window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon, at the empire he had built on the foundation of abandoned responsibilities, and he understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he had become exactly what he had once feared. A rich man with an empty soul, a success story with a hollow center, a billionaire who had traded his humanity for an empire that meant nothing without someone to inherit it. The irony was so perfect, it felt like divine punishment. That night, Ngozi found the investigator's report. She had suspected something for weeks, had noticed his distraction, his insomnia, the way he stared into space during dinner parties. She was not a foolish woman, and a foolish woman does not marry a billionaire by accident. She confronted him in their bedroom, the report in her hands, her face a mask of controlled fury. You have children, she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. 2 boys. With your maid. And you kept this from me. Adabio looked at her and realized that in this moment he could choose what kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. He could deny it, could claim the investigator was wrong, could use his lawyers and his money to bury the truth so deep it would never surface, or he could speak the truth and accept the consequences. Yes, he said simply, they are my sons, and I abandoned them. Ngozi's laugh was bitter and sharp. Do you have any idea what this will do to us? The scandal, the social disgrace, the investors who will walk away from a man who couldn't keep his own house in order. She was already calculating, already planning the divorce that would split his empire down the middle, already thinking of her exit strategy. But Adabio, for the first time in their 5-year marriage, looked at his wife with complete clarity. I don't care, he said, and the words felt like freedom. Those boys are my blood. That woman raised them alone while I built towers. and I will not abandon them again." Ngozi stared at him, as if seeing a stranger. "You're destroying everything we built," she whispered. "No," Adabio said quietly. "I'm trying to build something real." She left that night, her designer suitcases rolling across the marble floors, and Adabio sat alone in his mansion that suddenly felt less like an achievement and more like a mausoleum. The next morning, Adabio drove to the hospital, not in his Mercedes, but in a modest car he rarely used, his bodyguards left behind, his phone turned off. He found Chidi's room and stood outside the door, watching through the window as Amara sat beside the bed, holding her son's small hand, singing to him in a voice cracked with exhaustion. The boy was unconscious, his small body fighting a battle that wealth could end in minutes, but poverty turned into a death sentence. Adabio approached the nurse's station, his hands shaking, and paid the entire hospital bill in cash, along with enough extra to ensure Chidi received the best care available. He did it anonymously, through a nurse who asked no questions when he pressed the money into her hands. Then he turned and walked away, because he was not yet brave enough to face Amara, not yet strong enough to look into the eyes of the woman he had betrayed and see his own cowardice reflected back at him. Over the following week, as Chidi recovered, and Amara returned to her Fufu stand, with prayers of gratitude on her lips, Adabio hired private tutors for his sons, paid for their school fees anonymously, and arranged for Amara's stand to receive a business grant through a charity program. He did all of this from a distance, like a ghost, trying to fix what he had broken without having to face the consequences. But distance, he was learning, does not equal redemption, and money does not equal absolution. 2 weeks after Chidi was discharged from the hospital, Adabio made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He drove to Mushin Market in the evening, when the trading was winding down and the orange sun was turning the dust golden. He stepped out of his car, alone, unguarded, dressed simply, and walked through the market with every eye upon him, because everyone recognized the billionaire who had no business in these streets. He reached Amara's stand, just as she was packing up for the day. Chidi and Chidera, helping her clean the pots, their laughter cutting through the evening air like bells. She saw him approach and froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The boys looked up at this stranger with curious eyes, not knowing they were looking at their father. Adabio stopped 3 feet from her, and the market grew silent, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Amara," he said, and his voice broke on her name. She said nothing, just stared at him, with eyes that held 8 years of silence. He took a breath and knelt in the dust. Adabio Okoro, who had shaken hands with presidents, who had negotiated with multinational corporations, who had never bowed to anyone, knelt in the market dust before the woman he had wronged. "I was a coward," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, because some confessions must be public to be real. "I chose money over love. I chose my ambitions over my blood. I told myself I was being practical, but I was just being selfish. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I abandoned my sons before they were born. And I have spent 8 years building an empire on the foundation of that betrayal, wondering why nothing I achieved ever felt like enough." His voice cracked, and tears ran down his face unchecked. "I do not ask for your forgiveness, because I do not deserve it. I do not ask to be their father, because I have not earned that title. I ask only for a chance, one chance, to do what I should have done 8 years ago, to stand beside you, to know my sons, to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what I threw away." The silence that followed was so complete that the evening birds seemed to stop singing. Amara looked down at this man kneeling in the dust, this man who had broken her heart and changed her life, this man who had given her the greatest gifts of her existence and then disappeared like smoke. She felt the eyes of her sons on her, felt the weight of 8 years pressing down, felt the anger and pain and exhaustion of every night she had cried herself to sleep while her babies slept beside her. And she felt something else too, the memory of a younger man before wealth had calcified his heart, a man who had dreamed aloud about changing the world, a man she had loved, not for what he had, but for who he was becoming. That man had died, or she had thought he did. But perhaps, she thought, looking into Adabio's red-rimmed eyes, perhaps that man had only been sleeping, buried under layers of ambition and fear. "Stand up," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. He stood, dust on his expensive trousers, his face wet with tears. "These are your sons," she said, putting her hands on Chidi and Chidera's shoulders. "Chidi and Chidera. They are 7 years old. They love mathematics and football. They ask about you every day, and I have never known what to tell them." The boys stared up at Adabio with wide eyes, beginning to understand. "You cannot buy your way into their lives," Amara continued. "You cannot send money and call yourself a father. If you want to know them, you must earn it. You must show up. You must be present. You must prove that you will not disappear again when things get difficult or inconvenient." Adabio nodded, unable to speak. "You hurt me," Amara said, and her voice finally cracked. "You broke something in me that took years to heal. I will never forget that. But these boys deserve a father, and I will not let my pain rob them of that chance. So yes, you may know your sons, but you will do it my way, on my terms, in my world. If you want to be part of their lives, you will come here, to this market, to this stand. You will not take them away from me. You will join us." She paused, wiping her own tears. "And you will start by telling them the truth about who you are and what you did, because I will not build their relationship with you on lies." And so began the slow, painful, beautiful process of redemption. Adabio came to the market every evening, at first awkwardly, then with increasing comfort. He met Mama Obi and the other market women who had supported Amara through her darkest years, and he sat with them and listened to stories of his son's childhood that he had missed. He learned that Chidi loved drawing and wanted to be an architect, that Chidera was fascinated by computers and spent hours at the community library teaching himself coding. He realized with a sharp pang that Chidera had inherited his own gift for technology, and he had not been there to nurture it. The boys were wary at first, these small versions of himself, with their mother's wisdom in their eyes. They asked him why he had left, and Adabio told them the truth, that he had been afraid, that he had chosen wrongly, that he was sorry in ways he could never fully express. They listened with the seriousness of children who have grown up too fast. And then Chidi asked the question that broke Adabio's heart. "Will you leave again?" And Adabio, looking into eyes that mirrored his own, made a promise he intended to keep, even if it cost him everything. "Never. I will never leave again." The divorce from Ngozi was brutal and public, splitting his empire and his wealth, filling the newspapers with scandal that destroyed his carefully crafted image. Investors withdrew. Business partners distanced themselves. Society women who had once courted his attention now whispered behind their hands. Adabio watched his empire shake and realized he didn't care. Or rather, he cared about different things now. He set up a trust fund for his sons, not to replace his presence, but to support it. He invested in Amara's business, helping her expand the Fufu stand, into a proper restaurant. He attended parent-teacher meetings and school plays. He taught Chidera coding in the evenings and spent weekends helping Chidi draw building designs. Slowly, painfully, he built a relationship with his sons, not on the foundation of his wealth, but on the simple revolutionary act of showing up. 2 years passed like water finding its level, reshaping the landscape of their lives into something none of them had imagined. Amara's Fufu stand had grown into Mama Amara's kitchen, a modest but thriving restaurant that employed 6 people from the market and served the best fufu in Mushin. Chidi and Chidera were 9 years old now, confident boys who called Adabio Baba, and had learned that family was not about where you lived, but about who showed up when it mattered. Adabio's empire had stabilized after the scandal, smaller but more focused, and he had learned to measure success differently, not in stock prices, but in his sons' laughter, not in board meetings, but in Sunday afternoons spent teaching them to play chess. He and Amara were not lovers. That bridge had burned too completely to rebuild, but they had become something perhaps more valuable. Partners in the shared project of raising good men. They sat together at school functions, made decisions together about the boys' education, and sometimes, in quiet moments, they talked about what had been lost and what had been found. One Sunday evening, as the 4 of them sat outside the restaurant, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and gold, Chidi asked his father a question. "Baba, do you regret it? Everything that happened?" Adabio looked at his son, then at Chidera, then at Amara, and he answered with the hard-won wisdom of a man who had lost everything to find what mattered. "I regret the pain I caused. I regret the years I missed. I regret the coward I was. But I cannot regret the journey that brought me back to you, because without it, I would never have learned what wealth really means." Chidera, always the thoughtful one, nodded slowly. "Mama says that God writes every story for a reason, even the painful chapters." Amara smiled, her hand reaching out to ruffle her son's hair. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the hardest lessons teach us the most important truths." As the evening deepened and the Lagos sky turned from gold to purple to the deep blue of approaching night, Adabio sat with his sons and the woman who had taught him the difference between having everything and having what mattered, and he understood at last what his grandmother had tried to tell him all those years ago in the village, that a man's true wealth is not measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in the eyes that light up when he enters a room, in the small hands that reach for his, in the love that remains even after betrayal, in the mercy that offers second chances to those brave enough to change. The market around them was closing down, traders packing up their wares, the sounds of Lagos settling into its evening rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played old high-life music, and the smell of frying akara drifted on the breeze. This was not the life Adabio had imagined when he was building his empire, but it was, he realized, a better one. Richer in all the ways that mattered, fuller in all the spaces that money had left hollow. He had learned what the ancestors had always known, that the seeds you plant in darkness will always grow toward the light, that blood cannot hide, even when you try to bury it. That redemption is not a destination, but a daily choice to do better than you did yesterday. And as he watched his sons laugh and chase each other between the restaurant tables, as he caught Amara's eye and saw something like forgiveness in her smile, Adabio Okoro, who had once thought success meant erasing his past, finally understood that true success means having the courage to face it, to own it, to make amends for it, and to build something honest and real on the ruins of your mistakes. The past does not disappear when you ignore it. It simply waits, patient as stone, until you are finally ready to turn around and look it in the eyes. And when you do, when you finally find the courage to face what you have done and who you have hurt, that is when the real work begins. Not the work of building empires, but the work of rebuilding souls, of transforming regret into responsibility, of turning the bitter lessons of yesterday into the wisdom that guides tomorrow. This was not the ending Adabio had planned, but it was perhaps the ending he deserved. Not perfect, not painless, but honest and earned, built on truth rather than illusion, on presence rather than presence, on love that had survived abandonment and emerged scarred but unbroken on the other side.